Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining the next part of today's series. This one's titled Craft Text as Material. And as we mentioned earlier, we are streaming this to YouTube live from Fourth Space. We are also located at unceded Indigenous lands in Tkaronto, Montreal. We're running this event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so comments or questions are more than welcome there in the chat. And those of you in the space, so that everyone can hear, just let us know and make sure we get a microphone over to you also. With that, it's my pleasure to pass things over to scholar in residence and interdisciplinary studies practices in the fine arts, Molly Claire Gillett. Molly Claire, welcome back.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, and everybody online. And hello, Patrick and Kate. So nice to see you all the way from Alberta. I'm not going to start this roundtable discussion with introductions. I'm going to let each of the guests introduce themselves. That's how we'll start off. So this conversation is going to begin with each of the guests introducing themselves and talking a little bit about their practice as a maker and a writer. And then I have some questions for the guests. We're gonna hopefully ask each other some questions, keep the conversation bouncing back and forth between this room here and this virtual space here. And then if we have time at the end, we'll also welcome questions from the audience as well. So I'll start quickly by introducing myself, and then I'm gonna fuss away at the computer and get a slideshow maybe going so that we have some images to reference. I'm Molly Claire Gillett. I think I've been introduced 3 or 4 times already today, but I'll tell you why I'm interested in this conversation. First of all, I'm so excited to be sitting here and speaking with all of these wonderful people who I've been lucky enough to know a little bit about their work and also talk to all of them about writing and writing in relation to making and writing as making and thinking about writing in particular in relation to craft, the craft of writing, and how one's practice as a person engaged in craft might change the way that we think about writing. Much of my practice is based around writing, and a project that I'm working on right now, just to give a little bit of a context of how I think about writing, is a book manuscript where I'm incorporating kind of speculative historical fiction that turns a little bit into autoethnography about my research process and my connection to the subject matter. And I'm kind of weaving that together with historical study in a way that feels a little bit scary sometimes, because I wonder what people will think. But that's something that I'm working on right now, and that's kind of what my practice as a writer is oriented around. I'll pass it maybe over to Morris next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Morris Fox. Just wanted to shout out my mom's in the chat today, so thank you so much, Mom, for joining us. So yeah, I'm a queer artist practitioner and also a poet. Currently doing my Humanities Interdisciplinary PhD at Concordia. My kind of interest in terms of writing and praxis is how writing and visual arts practice come together, especially around issues of ecological anxiety, as well as ecological queer practices in the forest, etc. The image right now is one of my pieces I did a while ago, but I was really interested in the temperature or what are the things that exist within archives that can speak for themselves, including documents which are text and objects, and how to bring those together outside of that to create new meaning or to create conversations with the ghosts of the past. So yeah, that's my practice. That's another image of mine. So I'll just quickly say, I'm interested in many forms of communication, especially semaphores. So how a visual sign can also communicate something across distance, especially with affect or feeling.
Okay, we'll pass it over to our friends on the screen here.
Who are we going to fight to go first?
You go first.
Okay. My name is Patrick Moskwa. I have a 20-year history of as an architect, and then I moved into teaching and into an MFA in craft here in Calgary. And Yeah, I'm not sure. It's really difficult to define myself as a craft practitioner. Even though I have a craft MFA, I do think through my work as an architect, and I think through writing as a craft practitioner, and I think through my craft as an artist. And so I think yeah, it's kind of a challenge. And Kate and I have been battling this question since we were chatting about it. We always battle this question. But yeah, I came to the craft practice as a means to move slightly away or tangential to my architecture practice. Thinking about material and thinking about the stories and the narratives that of objects that we live with and the things that I would be designing into a house or into another structure. And yeah, and the life that exists within those objects. And that kind of led me to this is a way of thinking through writing as a means to tell those stories from another perspective. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kate Ritchie, here in Calgary with Patrick. I received my MFA in craft from AU Arts, I guess last year. I'm a weaver, and with that, I think there's like this like inherent connection between weaving and writing to me. And I think with language, we see that fiber words creeping into language and kind of cross-pollinating. But I will say the idea of writing has always been daunting, and it never felt as if a space existed for the way that I wrote. And so like coming into a mostly craft space and like working with craftspeople, it was really liberating to be around folks who thought in the same ways or were open to this use of material in a new way. And I think that's the best way to describe it. But also I think like you'll see a couple of my images going through there. Primarily I'm thinking a lot about how things come apart and come back together again, and how many times we as individuals and as objects also can come apart and come back together again, and maintaining versions of self in that. And it's also like a vision of queer homemaking. It's like there's a lot of things all tied up in it. But yeah, so anyway, thank you for having us.
Thank you. So my first question for you is, in planning this conversation, I really wanted to, as I said, bring the three of you together because you're all deeply engaged with thinking, not just doing craft or craft adjacent practices, but thinking about it, theorizing, thinking carefully about these words and this language, as well as writing as a practice. And I remember Patrick and Kate, when you came to speak to my students in my class about craft and home, you read these beautiful, beautiful pieces of composition to them, and they loved it. They loved hearing writing and hearing writers read their writing. It was really impactful. And so this word craft is a really capacious and also contentious, much debated term. We're not here to try and define it. You know, we can direct you to some books about that. You can engage with that debate later. But my question is, this word, if we think about this word, what is it about the word craft that is helpful for you in framing your practice? So how are you engaging with this idea of craft? Just to kind of set our terms a little bit. Anyone feel free to jump in here.
I think of craft, Molly, I think you kind of like hit on like in introducing the question there, it's like, oh, there's a lot to kind of like work through in the word craft and defining it. But the reason that craft is so important to me is like what it is and also what it isn't, defining itself in like, I am very passionate about the fact that I do and make and am a crafts person, but it's also what sets it apart, I think. It's a matter of like repetition. It's a way of and it's also a wayfinding technique as well. If someone says they work in craft, or it's like a signifier. It's like a way to flag each other, I think. And it's a way to find each other. It's not really a good way to kind of describe it, but I think that it's like for me, it's a wayfinding technique.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it, yeah, has folded into that, or folding into that, a way of making that is really intimate between the object and the maker, in a way of exploring a material to the limit of breaking that material so we can see how far that material can work, and a combination of material and thinking. And yeah, really for me, where I think about craft and how I situate myself in it is that it is a material studies, right? It is a way of exploring that material to see what it tells us and what it can tell an audience, rather than just throwing some things together, and building a beautiful, incredible sculpture. It's really about how the materials are relating to one another and relating to myself as a maker and relating to the audience, in that way.
Yeah. I think for me, I really love, Kate, when you're saying about craft being a hanky itself, just as kind of a metaphor for, finding community and meaning, also a delicious object that one can touch and feel, also something that connects to memory work, to modes of being in the world. I think craft for me, in the kind of bridge between text and textile, certainly can communicate both ideas, can also be about community cloth. I think about, as a queer person and crafter, that it's also a way of finding meaning in new ways of being in the world through the object, and the object not only being the thing itself, the material, but also the material that we weave together, whether that be community or et cetera. So yeah, that's my excitement with craft, which it wasn't always. I came from a studio practice, and craft and text writing kind of came together for me in my 30s. So after I'd come out as queer also, so that's an important connection for me as well.
Because I know what my next question is, every time you say craft, I'm replacing it with writing in my mind. And it maybe with some answers more than others, when I replace the word craft with writing, it's this really beautiful way of thinking about writing, writing as a wayfinding technique, writing as a way of building community, but then also writing as struggling with material, And I think that when we do write, we struggle with material. And my question for you in relation to thinking of text as a material and thinking about this way of speaking about craft in relation to writing practice, one of the clearest parallels for me between my making and my writing is this feeling of working with a material, as you were saying, Patrick, and the crossover of these processes from making to writing. I work with threads and textiles mostly, and so I often think about writing in these kind of textile metaphors, like pulling out threads or tracing a thread through a text, or like stretching, like blocking a piece of knitting, like stretching out a chapter to kind of like make it fit. And so I think of my writing often in these textile metaphors. And so I wonder, are there parallels in practice between the ways that you engage with materials, like physical materials that you can touch, and text? Or do you see text as a physical material?
Yeah, I see text as a physical material, absolutely. And it's, again, for me, it's a way of combining things in a way that isn't necessary. Well, they have context, right? And if you combine them with another thing, suddenly that context changes. And my writing practice is, yeah, narrative. And Kate and I were talking about this on Saturday when we had brunch, because apparently we dress the same and go for the same things. So we were chatting about it over lunch, and we were talking about the way that we write is really a queer way of acknowledging our world, and a queer way of teaching, and a queer way of learning through narrative. And And yeah, I think of my work and my writing practice as a queer way of making, because they relate back and forth to one another. And I'll stop and layer on another layer of latex onto something, and then I'll wait for that thing to sort of, well, to cure and to sit and live on that object, as I then move over to the writing practice, and I think through that and I add that back into that making, and they go back and forth and back and forth. And the stack of bricks that you see in that one image were made one at a time. And that was the intent of it, was that there are 92 of them and they take 5 hours to make each. And so they were stacked one at a time as this sort of memory bank and reformation of the story that belongs inside of them. And I think for my writing practice, I move between these tiny little moments of poetry, and I build that back into the object with the next layer or the next pour or the next manipulation of it. And as I write through a lot of things, I'm also not paying I pay a lot of attention to academic writing, but at the same time, I fold in poets, and I fold in novelists and graphic artists, all into that practice. And so rather than writing through my thesis with a group with a bunch of academics, I wrote through that thesis with Billy Ray Belcourt and T. Fleischman and Maggie Nelson. And they all appeared as kind of cohabitants of the space that I was occupying, and taking up that room beside me and with me and along for that journey. Yeah, I don't think I answered the question, but that's I'm going to leave it.
Yeah. Text as material is such an interesting idea to me. In that, like, I am constantly scribbling. I don't maintain a sketchbook because my objects are my objects, and then they're like, it's hard, it would be impossible for me to like sketch out what's going to happen in the process of undoing and redoing, like that kind of, like, it's a lost cause. Like, there's no way I'd be able to know. But my sketchbook is full of lists and thoughts and fragments of what I'm thinking about, and in that, like, it all ends up somewhere. So it all ends up in my writing somehow. So I like move things around. I take parts out, I move them into a new space. Or what if that fragment of text is in relation to this thing, or what if I pull something out of my notes app and it relates in another way to something I've seen of a collaborator's work or something else I've read. It's like that moving around and that constant reworking that happened, and it feels kind of trite almost, because it's not like as far as I understand it, it's like so weird to think of myself as a writer, but I do, as far as I understand it, this is what writers do. But I think that yeah, and also I think it'd be silly for me to also just like ignore the fact that I physically use books to hold my objects. So like text is literally embedded into my work in a very like literal, eye rolly way sometimes. So anyway.
That was a great moment. Say that, because that was the moment that popped up on the screen.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how you use books?
Yeah.
This image will come back as you're telling us about it.
Yeah, of course. I love books, and I love fiber objects. And what happens in my undoing of objects, in order to keep the objects as intact as possible, I have landed on this solution, which is to use books. But I don't use books because of the words that they hold. I like value them because of their physical form, because they've got like strong spines and lots of flappy little pages, and they give me the ability to have like a million fingers. Like, what a dream. Like, I can hold every little piece of something. And so they end up being little looms or a million hands to hold these threads in order. Yeah. And so it's like the words on the page are less consequential. It's more so just like, thank God for your physical form.
Yeah, it's like the threads are taking primacy it's almost like a different kind of communication is taking primacy over the communication that's contained in the book.
Like, totally. Yeah.
What about you, Laura?
Yeah, I just love Kate's like the imagery of a million little fingers holding all the threads together. So I'm just sitting with that for a moment. But I have too many thoughts maybe about the connections between text and craft and writer's craft, etc. I also have a large. I'm a bibliophile. I can't stop collecting books. There's a scent which is specific to old books called Velicore. So I think a lot about just the immersion of an environment of writing and of reading around me constantly. I think in terms of this older connection also between text and textiles, where what is on the surface, what is woven into it. And then in terms of, I guess, my own practice, or what I've been thinking about lately, especially as it applies to kind of a different aspect of this particular day, which is about generative AI, and maybe how that's entering into things. I think about text, as the prophecy of the material object to come. So when I generate text and ideas in my notebooks, et cetera, those might end up being a prompt which becomes a visual object or a community roundtable, really anything. So text structures things in terms of generating my visual practice, and vice versa also happens. So within my poetry practice, the objects and other concerns of my practice get woven back into my poetry. So my poetry often deals with visual subject matter. It's a very visual poetry. It's not in terms of its structure, it's not concrete poetry, but in terms of evoking memories or images. So yeah, that's a very convoluted, not quite answer also. But I think, queer definitely is the kind of crux of things for me, and L.J. Roberts and Daniel Fountain and others have kind of talked about craft in its verb form of crafting, of imagining new ways of being, especially queer ways of being, through their practice, through crafting rather than the noun craft of the object. So I think that's where text becomes exciting, is in its ability to, one, be a accessible medium, and then also in terms of how it can generate, right?
Can we go back to when you said text as prophecy?
Yes.
Yes.
I've been thinking about prophecy through, I guess, AI, right? So I learned in a workshop that I ran with Zeph Thibaudeau and Geneviève Moisin at Milieu, where we did a kind of text and textile and AI poetry generative session. So Zeph was saying that the AI is trying to figure out what the rest of the sentences, it's trying to prophecy from you, from your prompt, what the rest of the text should be. So that made me think, oh God, well, like text itself, how we speak, et cetera, utterances are also prophecies of maybe enactments or other things that we want to have exist, which might not exist yet. Or, and I think text as prompt for visual art also has that capacity of prophesying the outcome. I think in terms of, textile productions, also weaving, you figure out the pattern and then it gets made, it gets prophesied as the object, but even at the beginning stage of it, you kind of understand the prophecy of that. Sorry, I'm now just buzzwording prophecy, but you understand, like the outcome is as envisioned in your mind or as coded, right? So within the coding structure of the weaving.
Well, it also makes me think about this way that text as a form of communication impacts all of our practices, but especially practices that involve collaboration. Makes me think about what Caroline was talking about in the keynote, this idea of creating platforms and collaborating with people and making connections in order to get work done. And I think you could think of text as prophecy in relation to that, to just planning things, and the role of text, not necessarily in a beautiful piece of poetry or in a beautiful piece of writing that can bring someone to tears, but text as a list, as you're saying, Kate, a plan for a piece of work that you're about to do. We use text in these ways, whether it's to communicate with ourselves in the future, or remembering something, or whether it's to communicate with somebody else that we're working with. I think we often forget that we're using writing in those contexts, but this is also writing, and it's a really important type of writing in the context of craft practice or artistic practice or pedagogical practice, just as important of as these compositions that we maybe spend more time and intellectual energy on. So there's that nice parallel there as well. I have some more questions, but I also would love you to speak to each other. So jump in if you wish.
Morris,
Yeah.
I thought it was, I love that Molly kind of hit on the prophecy, but I'm also thinking of, you mentioned text as an accessible means of like connecting or communicating. Can you kind of elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think, I'm also plugging earlier on, in the introductory address really of today, there was that mention of just that, it's a, so like compared to other mediums of creative expression, text requires very little to produce. It can be produced, with in different ways. It doesn't necessarily even have to be visualized. So, I think text in that way is accessible. Obviously, it's not accessible in other ways when it becomes, the craft of the writer, where you think of honing the craft of writing, which is a longer journey or embarkation, so to speak. But I think it's both accessible, but then also, I think back to my own 18-year-old days taking FFAR 250 with Bob Gifford, that the hesitation to write as a student in fear of failure, for example, or the expectation of a grade at the end of something can be a barrier to a form that itself, for me, brings a lot of joy. So, yeah.
It makes me think of another question that I have for all of you, because I know that you're writers, you're makers, and you're also involved in teaching in some capacity. And so are there ways that you speak about writing with your students, or prompts that you give your students that draw from your craft practice, or ways that you might speak about writing or engage with writing in the classroom that draw from this kind of intertwining that we've been talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I'm teaching a course at the moment. This is the first time I've ran the course, but I've been involved in it for 8 years since it sort of bubbled up to the surface. And it's a course that it's a civic innovation course, a social innovation course. And the question that we're asking, and everybody hates these "how might we" questions, but they're just challenging. But the question is, how might we disrupt downtown spaces to build community? And the intent is that we're looking at marginalized groups, or we're looking at those who the city wasn't built for, and then trying to address issues that are systemic, or issues that are there, or just for my students to feel their way through a downtown space. Calgary is very alienating in its downtown space. And a lot of the students who are in that class have never actually been downtown before, or they just use it as this transient moment to get from one bus to the next, or one train to the bus to get out to campus. But So the way I've organized that class is into three different ways, three different parts. They first do a project that is placing themselves within the city, and present me an object of some sort. That could be a piece of writing, that could be a group of artifacts that they've collected. It could be a video of them walking around and telling us about their experience and where they see themselves within the city. And then the second part of that is to look at it from an ethnographic perspective. And so they get together in pairs and look at a culture that necessarily isn't within them. But yeah, and again, look at that through an object perspective. And again, most of those ones turned out as tours, as Jane's walks through the city, and represented in the video, that had text and image and motion and graphics all kind of blended in together. And then the last way is to look at it as a conversation with the city. And so they go out and make interventions, and they sticker bomb or intervene in some way to disrupt the spaces to help highlight certain aspects of that city that are unique. And what I try to do with them is to encourage them to speak, and write them as journal entries in a way, or write them as love letters, or write them as a series of engagements all through that. So we do a lot of site writing in that class, and part of the site writing is for them 1 3-hour period. We just go out and we sit in one location downtown, one location. They can't move. And all they do is either document one class, which is literally just writing list upon list upon list upon list. And I send them out with stacks of sticky notes, and each thing has to be written on a sticky note. And then they come back to the class and I put them on the wall. And then another 3-hour moment is where we sit again in the same place, but we start to write through the objects that are engaging in that space. And so a light pole or a park bench or a garbage can or a floor tile, if they're inside, which happened to be inside that day because it was -30 degrees outside. But they write through the perspective of that object, telling the story about where that object lives, and who that object is. And we did that in your class, when we gave them that writing prompt. And that then folds out into how they start using those techniques to describe in different ways, rather than having them write a paper, right? And even then, when 2 students decided to write a paper, they started involving themselves into it a little bit more and input their own piece, like little pieces of poetry or their own snippets of a journal that they were writing. And those pieces then became quite alive, and they were interjecting with images and video. And so they became these really dynamic moments that really got the students to understand a little bit in a wildly different way, than saying, okay, well, go write me a paper about, third spaces and what does that mean? They embedded themselves in those third spaces and wrote through them. Which is actually quite compelling, and they learned quite a bit in a different way.
Does anyone else want to speak to that, or feel free to also ask each other questions if you wish?
Patrick, I really love that assignment, and just all the really rich ways of looking at a gap or looking at a way and the problems of how does an object, how does a city, how does a community speak, and who gets to speak for it. I was thinking a lot, just as you were speaking, about an essay by Mikhail Epstein called On the Lyrical Museum, where he talks about what if there was a museum with all the toothbrushes ever disposed of in the world? Whose toothbrush, what would that toothbrush mean by itself versus as an accumulation? What is the discrete world that is created in that one object, and what does it speak to? Sorry, it's a bit of an aside, but I was thinking about all the sticky notes collected and put together as this kind of accumulation, and I see accumulation also in your practice in terms of the layers of the latex object, or the soap, the gesture of throwing the soap. I think you're throwing the soap against the wall. I can't tell exactly.
Oh, and I was throwing latex against the wall in that case.
Okay, yeah, latex against the wall.
Doesn't matter. Whatever it was, there was something hurled at the wall.
Was something happening, yeah. But I love also that lavender and leather are listed in that work. And I was just thinking about how lavender as a verb form, lavendering, means to kind of take out all of your sheets and, spritz them with lavender, make sure that moths aren't growing on them. So there's a kind of accumulation of care. And obviously there's not even a queer metaphor, but a queer reality within what lavender does within our community and how it's been used against us, but also how we've reclaimed it. So I don't know where I'm going with that, but there it is.
Well, I think one of the things that you're doing is showing the richness and slipperiness of language, right? Which is also something that we engage with in writing and in making, because many of the materials that we use are also, signifiers in the same way that language.
Yeah. And what do you do when that becomes literally is out of hand? Like Kate, with your work, where the books are holding all these threads together to make the work. There's these actors outside of ourselves, which are so necessary in producing work, right? Whether they're inanimate or animate or human or more than human. I think there's a politics of care within that, or repair even. I don't know if you want to speak a bit about that, or if that's a question relevant to today.
Yeah, but here, I do think that I can make that jump in that connection, I think, because that is, care is like the underlining of everything I do. I intend so much to be careful, and I fail all the time, especially with these objects, but I do my best, right? But I think that that idea of care comes into the writing as well, because I think of wanting to bring readers as close to the experience of making the work and being in my body, or at least next to me at the loom bench, and we're sitting there together, or we're sitting and we're kneeling over a bathtub together, that we can kind of share in that way. And I think in order to do that, the reason I write in the way I do, other than the fact that I don't know any other way, is that one of the benefits is that I'm really trying to make it so any reader can connect to it. I don't want barriers up, and so that's why I was the idea of being accessible is I want anyone to be able to pick up a piece of writing and it not to be so dense and alienating and feel like it's not for me. I want people to be able to read and connect to the work and feel like, oh, I know what it's like to babysit too, or I know what it's like to feel frustrated in a moment, and when you're doing your best and it's not working, or what have you. And I think that one of the reasons it took me, Maurice, you said you discovered craft a little bit later, and I've been a fiber person my entire life, but I discovered my capacity to work in the academy later. And one of the reasons is because it didn't feel like it was a place for me. So if I have been able to work my way in and find a little niche, what a joy to be able to be but actually I think everyone can do this. I think everyone has the ability to research and make, and I think we all do it in our day-to-day lives. And I think that just these barriers that we put up with language, or I don't understand that French dude, that theory, it's just by putting those barriers up, you limit who can access things. So I don't, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I also love that it relates, my mom and I sometimes joke about the shopping list we used to, make for each other or whatever, can you go and grab milk, etc. Some of them would get into these kind of elaborate list poem moments where, 3 grapefruits, 2 blood oranges, and, whatever else, fromage, I don't know, became this passcode or act of care between the two of us of just, what practically do you want in terms of, things in the fridge, but also how do we make this humorous or a poem as well? Because sometimes they were kind of beautiful poems, but day to day and routine at the same time.
Totally.
Do
And
you
I
think
love,
that?
sorry. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, Morris, I love, Patrick mentioned we went to brunch the other day, but like this idea that we don't make work for our moms. I literally said the other day, I was like, I want to be able to write in a way that my mom feels like she can read it and understand it. Not that because she's a nurse. She has a different background to like, she has a different understanding of like what text is, and that I want anyone to be able to read. And so like, anyway, I think I want moms to be able to read the work, even though it might be deeply uncomfortable sometimes or whatever. Because like, it's very vulnerable or what have you. Sorry.
Mhm.
No, and that accessibility is also then a way of bridging worlds, right? So being able to be closer to each other too. Yeah. My mom said something about lists including the impossibilities like crocodiles on them too. In the chat, anyways.
I love that.
Well, I have two questions. We're also almost out of time, so I have to pick one. I don't know which one to pick. Okay, I'm going to pick the second one. I wonder, we're talking about accessibility and we're talking about moms, and I think that craft is something that is often demeaned because of its accessibility and its connection to moms, or the fact that it's often feminized or it's often associated with familial connections rather than the academy, something that's taught intergenerationally among families and communities. Often, historically, women's work has been considered craft, whereas work historically done by men has been considered, all of this stuff about craft that we know. And I wonder if the way that you conceive of your work of craft connects to, or how you see it connecting to the way that you think about your writing as something that is accessible and maybe existing outside of the academy, but pushing its way in and saying like, accessibility should be something that can be inside the academy. Like, I want my mom to engage with my writing. I don't want to create these boundaries and barriers that keep my work as a maker or that keep my work as a writer in an academy and inaccessible, or in a gallery space and inaccessible. Is there a parallel between your making and writing in terms of thinking about accessibility and the way that sometimes the academy creates these barriers that keeps people that are not trained in a very specific way away from cultural production, whether that be writing or making? Was that very convoluted?
No, it's just big. Um, I also came to craft quite late in life. I mean, I've been practicing architecture, and that's my lens through thinking about craft, right? And sort of embedding myself within the institution, within those sort of that framework. It was terrifying to need to start writing more deeply. And it was rather confusing too, because I think you're situated within an institution where you're supposed to be writing in a very specific way. And that didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the objects were receiving the care that they needed to, that the words were receiving the reciprocity from the objects as they needed to. And it was a challenge, and I just told myself, oh, fuck it. Like, this is how you're going to write. This is how it needs to work. You're embedding this into the practice every moment. You're writing these stories, you're writing these love poems, you're writing these notes to yourself and to your objects and them in return. And so that's how the objects must live. That's how you can present it to a world. And I was lucky enough to have a committee that was really content to do that, but boy, was that a struggle. And I think the idea of accessibility in that case is, it's powerful because it allows everybody to begin to engage in the work in a new way, right? And highlight certain aspects of the way we've always done things to turn it on its head a little bit. And I think we do ourselves a disservice from an institutional point of view, from an academic point of view, if we force the hand that was there before to just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And suddenly we turn into these tiny little white boxes that only 4 people can go in, and only 3 people will understand. And it doesn't make any sense. And so I approach that in my work by choosing objects that are really powerful and really meaningful to me, but also can have power and strength for someone else. And so whether you know the story that's behind the 3-way switches, it doesn't matter, right? Because we all have experience with a 3-way switch. We all have experience of embedding ourselves, or being in relation to those. And yeah, and same with the domestic bricks, and similarly with that welcome mat in Kate's work, for example, and Morse's work, for example. We all have our own interpretation and our own moment and experience with those objects. And I think if we say, well, no, that thing is only about this and it has to be read in this way, then we alienate everybody from it. And what's the point of that? Like, but yeah, there's no care, there's no charm, there's no relation that happens between them.
I'm conscious that we're a little bit past our time. We started about 5 minutes late, so I think we're okay to keep the conversation going for a little bit longer. But for those of you who are here in person, if you want to go and get some lunch, that's totally fine, but we won't maybe cut off so abruptly. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience. You're more than welcome to ask them, or if you have questions for each other, and then we'll let you go eat something. Actually, I guess for you folks, it's still the middle of the morning. We won't let you away that fast.
And anyone on Zoom can put their questions in the chat, or they could turn on their cameras or microphones.
I'm so glad that you brought up the idea of caring for objects by writing about them, because that was my first question. That might have been a better one to ask. Like, is writing about your work an expression of care for the work? And it seems like the answer is a resounding yes.
Yes.
Good. Confirmation.
Yeah, answer yes.
I don't think there are any questions in the chat or from the audience. Do you have any last questions for each other? I think we could probably keep chatting about this subject for a couple hours, but again, lunch needs to be eaten.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all of you for being here, and thank you for zooming in from Alberta. We appreciate your time so much. And thank you, Morris, as well, for coming over from the EV building. And we'll see you all at 1, I believe, for the next panel. So thank you very much.
Such a pleasure, Patrick and Kate.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everyone. We'll be closing the live stream now, but we'll keep the Zoom open, and we'll come back for the next event. And just remember that this remains available on our YouTube channel, and I'll see you again soon.